Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Tevora Talks. I am your host, Cash, and as always, joined by my co-host and partner in cybercrime, Matt Mosley. Happy Friday. How you doing, sir? Good
I'm
talking
doing
to you.
great. I'm really excited. We got a guest today.
Yeah, we have a great guest today, and I'm actually really excited for this combo. So should we just dive into it?
Let's just do it.
Yeah, let's do the hype. So we have a great guest today. Really appreciate your time coming to join us. Let's kind of build the suspense. So he is the leader of the X Force IR Global Remediation Function. He has cybersecurity skills across many different disciplines, and he is the writer of the really amazing book called Cyber Breach Response that actually works. Drum roll, please. Can I get a drum roll? Everybody, Andrew Gorecki. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Yeah, welcome.
Hey, welcome. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Cash. Thanks, Matt. My pleasure to be here.
Hey, awesome for you to be here with us. We're excited to talk to you. I know Matt has a ton of questions that he wants to ask you. I don't even know where to start. I kind of want to just pass it to you. Maybe give the two people that listen to us a little bit of a shout out about yourself. So I'll pass it to you.
Yes. Hi everyone. So as Kash mentioned, my name is Andrew Gorecki. So I'm currently with the X-Force Services Group of IBM Security, originally from Europe, and I started my consulting career about 10 years ago. And generally, I'm a jack of all trades, interested in anything related to cyber, and that's about me.
Very cool.
Oh, awesome. Yep.
Yeah. So Andrew and I met about 3 years ago. We won't say the client, but we met on a project. It was, I think, one of the first MageCart, or at least one of the major MageCart incidents, and loved working with Andrew and his team. Probably, and I honestly say this, one of the highlights of my career, not only because it was a pretty big incident, but just the fact that we had 4 different IR teams working together simultaneously.
Wow, that's cool.
And it was pretty incredible to watch everybody work together, and nobody was out there like blood in the water trying to steal work, or, and it's really kind of unheard of in consulting, at least from my experience. I've been on other incidents with other IR teams, and that's not the case. Looking at you, Microsoft. But yeah, no, it was a great experience, and so thank you for joining us, Andrew. I'm really glad that you could be here, and I'm glad that you accepted my LinkedIn request. I don't know why we weren't LinkedIn before, but
yeah, I'm surprised we just recently found each other on LinkedIn.
Yep. So yeah. Also, congrats. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I said I have the segue. I have the segue when you're ready.
Okay.
Should we do it now?
I just want to say congratulations, because actually 3 years ago when we were working that incident, Andrew had a daughter, and so he disappeared for 48 hours now. You didn't take any time off, but he did disappear for a little bit to tend to his baby, but now she's a couple years old, so that's good. So congratulations.
Nice.
And thank you. And then I decided that having a baby wasn't enough, so I decided to write a book.
There you go.
There you go. Oh, see, he's good at the segue too.
Yeah.
I don't even need to be here anymore. I'm done. I'm off. But no, you know what I was thinking of, the fact that you said, hey, that thing that you guys were working on together was 4 different cyber incident teams there, which brings up a real good thing about the book, because the book is all about organizational approach and which framework. So,
yeah,
absolutely. like you kind of mentioned in your book, Andrew, right? There's so many different frameworks. Everybody has their twist on it. Some companies don't have one at all. And that's the awesome thing about your book. It's like, hey, if you don't know what you're doing at all, read this. You'll definitely figure it out by the end. But with that said, when you are working so many people together in that particular incident, what do you do? Like, which framework do you choose? Which one did you guys choose? And I know you mentioned in your book a lot about IBM's framework, and I'll definitely, if you want to give us some cool insider info on that too. But yes. So I'll pass it to you, I guess.
So maybe firstly, I'll mention why I wrote this book. So when I got into incident response about 4 years ago, what I realized that a lot of what we were doing was based on tribal knowledge, and it was across all firms. And I also, what I noticed that, as incident responders, we are pretty good at the technical stuff and essentially, collecting, analyzing data and, mapping attacker activity in the compromised environments. But I think, as incident responders, and I'm talking about the industry in general, we've not been really great at executive level communication. We've not been great at translating kind of investigative findings into a language that anyone could understand, especially business executives. But
Right.
also, what I noticed is that because of the tribal knowledge and how sometimes incident response investigations, how chaotic those can be, I noticed that there was a need for a bit of organization and structure. And I was doing my own research and kind of putting together a framework. And at some point, I decided that it's really a good material for a book, and I decided to share my findings with organizations who may not necessarily have the same resources and expertise as incident response firms.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So when it comes to frameworks, for me, a framework is more about, the concepts and organization and providing a sense of direction. But I don't believe that there's like a silver bullet solution or cookie cutter that you could apply to all situations. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, use the book as a guidance and use frameworks as guidance, but develop something that works for you. There's no right or wrong. It's just very important that you have control over the investigation and you are driving the activities in the right way. And whether your framework is based on NIST, or whether it's based on what I wrote in my book, or you follow some other standard, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is that you are driving the incident response investigation and according to business objectives, but also, you achieve the desired outcome.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that for sure. Just in the incidents that I've dealt with, yes, you can do 4 or 5 different ransomware incidents, but honestly, those 4 or 5 are all different, right? So it's always, there's always something different
every time.
And every organization is different. You got different tools, you got different staff, you got different capabilities as far as staff goes as well too. So I think that's definitely a good recommendation, right? Picking your framework as a guiding force, but then, developing your own. We get a lot of calls for playbooks, like people asking us, hey, can you just give us a template? Like,
what do we
do? We can, but there's a whole process that is involved in designing the playbook for your organization, right? They're not all the standard stuff. So it's definitely interesting, but a good point for sure. What would you say kind of what the biggest difference or advantage is from X-Force's preparation and cyber attack framework versus the other 2 that you mentioned, like MITRE's attack framework, and then also Lockheed Martin's chain?
That's a good question, Matt. So I think there are different frameworks or different life cycle models, and they also serve different purposes. So the reason why I decided to use the X-Force framework was not necessarily because I'm an employee of X-Force incident response or X-Force services. The reason I decided to use it because I thought that it was like a high-level conceptual framework that it's easy to use in kind of client conversations and explain how threat actors or attackers progress for the incident response life cycle, including preparation. And I think it's and I like the frame I like to use this framework for client conversations. However, kind of from an operational perspective and incident response perspective, I think MITRE attack is really the way to go because each phase corresponds to the various tactics employed by the threat actors, and it really lists out all the techniques within each tactic. So when you conduct an investigation and map your findings to MITRE, you can really see where the gaps are. For example, you may have detected evidence of lateral movement. But if you look at it from the kind of framework perspective, you see that the initial information related to initial access is lacking. So you may have to kind of keep tracking down the patient zero host and so on. So I think different frameworks have different purposes. Again, I don't believe there's a cookie cutter. I typically use what works for specific situations or situation.
Cool. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. A lot of the stuff always centers around kind of the NIST life cycle, right? That one's kind of the foundation, and then the other ones kind of get fit into it, which is always good. So at least you're familiar with them, right? Like for anybody that's listening and you want to get an IR, definitely get familiar with all of them and understand the differences, right? Like I think Lockheed Martin's kill chain is important
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't use it because it's copyrighted. Is kind of the big driving force.
Yeah.
But Miter Attack is obviously great. And then X Forces I was familiar with when working with you guys actually. But I haven't dived too deep into it. So that's definitely something I'm going to take away and review on my own. I think that was one of the cool things about the book that I liked, was that you broke them out into different sections and kind of talked about the advantages and disadvantages of each one. So that was very cool.
So Matt, what I would like to mention, and,
go for it.
and feel free to chime in and provide your perspective. So kind of from a life cycle and framework perspective, we try to kind of, we created models in the industry, whether, you look at the NIST life cycle, MITRE, Attack, or some other frameworks. And those frameworks are, kind of, some of them are more linear, whereas other frameworks emphasize, the kind of iterative aspect of incident response lifecycle. But as you mentioned, I think every incident is different. And again, for me, a framework is about giving a sense of direction. But sometimes you start an incident and you deal with data theft, which is I think MITRE, if I remember correctly, is the objectives, and you have to work backwards. Whereas in other cases, you may see a bit of lateral movement. You may see the attacker trying to escalate privilege to the main admin. So for me, what I realized is that IR is not really a linear process, or it's not something that can easily fit into a pattern. But again, so again, the purpose of the framework is really just to kind of provide you a sense of direction rather than constrain you in your approach.
Very cool. Yeah, I think anybody, especially for those listening that don't do IR on a regular basis, this book is great for just kind of providing that guidance and kind of explaining that in our world we don't work linear, and things are not always sequential, and we may not get full containment as much as we like to get, before we move on to the next step. So, and sometimes at the nature of the incident, you can't do that, right? Because you're trying to keep the business up and running. You're trying to keep the enterprise alive. So
exactly, it's very much focused on tactics and it's very reactive and sometimes, like from an incident response perspective, you may want to do one thing, but the business has very different objectives. Like let's ransomware is a typical example when, we say to clients that you should perform a comprehensive investigation in order to create a timeline of attack activity. And then you based on the initial access, you establish recovery point objective for restoring data and servers. But many organizations cannot wait 2 weeks until they start recovering from ransomware attacks. So business priorities such as revenue and operations take precedence, and you have to start recovering systems before you've completed the investigation. So I do agree. It's not always you don't always follow the life cycle because sometimes you have competing priorities.
Yeah. But it's that experience and knowing when to not follow it to the T, right?
Yes. And also ability to articulate, because I think it's very, these days incident response is not really it's not only about the technical investigations. It's also about feeding information to legal professionals, working with management, sometimes executive management. And I think it's just very important to clearly articulate what the challenges might be, what the gaps, and make informed decisions. And I think that's what the industry should be more emphasizing, how we communicate our work and work closely with business and other stakeholders to ensure that they see value in our work, but also understand our approach.
Yeah, I'm glad you actually brought that up. That is one of the most important things, if at least in what my opinion is. Whenever I do a tabletop, and Cash can attest to this as well, incident coordinator. We always call that out
every single time
in one of our findings, just because we find that most organizations don't designate an incident coordinator, and I actually think that's highly important to make sure that designation is done, and that one person is the single source of information, and likewise for our team, right? So we have one incident coordinator on our team talking to that one incident coordinator on their team, so that no information's lost, no tasks are getting duplicated, nothing's falling through the cracks. And I mean, would you say that that's kind of been your experience in your career as far as how important an incident coordinator is?
Yes, I think that the structure that you kind of institute at the beginning of an investigation is very important. Because typically what I recommend to clients is that they assign an incident manager or incident handler or coordinator. There are different names for this
Right.
role, and that person is essentially responsible for coordinating tasks between the various parties involved. So let's say if you detect an incident and you determine that an attacker established a foothold and moved largely within the environment and is currently doing reconnaissance, um, you know you essentially may have to involve an incident response firm, like your firm, but you have to engage IT. In certain cases, legal may be involved because of the stuff, the risks, data privacy. There might be other stakeholders involved, across the enterprise, and maybe external vendors. And I think it's very important that someone coordinates the work, but also ensures that, the coordination and communication happens to the protocols set by the organizations. So in certain cases, I think these days legal risk is something that organizations are very nervous and worried about. So I do see that more and more organizations, engage incident response firms to conduct investigations at the direction of external or outside counsel. And I think it's very important to have someone who ensures that, the legal protocols set by legal counsel are followed. But also when it comes to dealing with IT, for example, we as cybersecurity professionals, we are focused on the stuff, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability aspect. Whereas for IT, availability is the primary kind of driving force, a priority. And I think it's very important to ensure that there's someone who can actually translate to IT that server has to be down. Or that server has to be, for example, isolated from the network because there has been evidence of unauthorized access to that server. But from an IT perspective, everything is working. The server is, receiving traffic, serving customers. So I think I do agree that there's a need for structure and proper incident management to ensure that not only the incident response aspect from a technical perspective is well managed, but also the communication between the various stakeholders, whether they are internal or external, is also properly managed.
Yeah, and I think navigating that legal route is important to incident responders nowadays too. And I noticed towards the end of your book, you actually have a whole section on that, and how to kind of go through what to say, what not to say, what needs to be marked on your reports, what needs to be put in your emails, what happens when a legal hold takes place. So I think that's good.
Unfortunately, Matt, I had to learn it the hard way. And
same here.
Hey, I want to bring up something. I'm genuinely curious. I talk to Matt about this all the time, and from your experience, you work with a lot of different cases and ransomware and everything. And playbooks, all good, great to have. Having an incident coordinator, great to have. But when these things actually happen, a ransomware attack actually happens on a big organization, like 50 domain controls went down, like several different countries globally, and these guys are all in this war room, sweating, panicking. Like how many times have you seen one guy flips? He's like, okay, hold on, guys, let's go to page 110 of playbook for incident response, ransomware. Here it says, hindsight's 2020, right? Write it down. We preach this, but it's kind of hard. How do you recommend people kind of try to reference, or I don't know?
So I've seen it during tabletop exercises. During incidents, I would say I do see it sometimes, but this is more typical of very mature clients who essentially have a cybersecurity program. They have processes developed, and they refine those processes, based on the lessons learned from incidents, whether they are minor incidents or bigger incidents. So I think this type of approach requires, a higher maturity. But also, I noticed that this approach works when clients focus on the higher level items. For example, okay, if there's data at risk, we have to pull data privacy and legal into the conversation. Whereas I think it's very difficult to pull a technical playbook and just go through the playbook because, as you know, every incident is different. And even if there's a playbook for, let's say, analyzing the compromise of Windows system, you may have a playbook until it's Windows 2003 or 2000, and your tools wouldn't collect live response data from that system, or that system, for example, is an OT system, and you cannot just try to collect data from the system because some critical manufacturing process depends on it. So from a technical perspective, I don't believe you can have a playbook. You can have some pointers, and I think I mentioned even in the playbook that a playbook doesn't replace critical thinking and skills. You still have to
100%.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
That one almost always takes over. It's like the default is
Yeah.
critical thinking skills, and then it's like, okay, then playbook,
Yeah. I
Yeah.
never say this to clients, but I think, just in my opinion, playbooks are kind of like a safety net. It's it's when you're panicking and you don't know what to do,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that there, at least that you have a manual that someone can go
Yeah.
to before you've
Yeah.
called the IR team to come in, or I guess called in the pros.
But
But
like
it's something that
that's-
you can look at, right? And like for your example, where it was the multiple domains across the world, like I was on that incident. I think that's where you reach the point where you can't really use a playbook, right? There's no playbook written to deal with multiple domain controllers around the world going down and how to recover from that. But the small instances like phishing, right? Like, oh, we have this suspected phishing email. Okay, I can run through this checklist to verify whether it's been, whether it's credential grabbing or whatever. I think those are good, but yeah, it's tough.
I 100% agree, because what I used to look at playbooks, Matt and Cash, from kind of enterprise perspective and enterprise incident response. But I realized that I had kind of very similar realization over the years that playbooks work for like very small incidents. Let's say you have a malware infected end user workstation, so the playbook would say, okay, isolate the system with your EDR, then maybe acquire an image of the system, do XYZ, just very simple steps for incidents that may not necessarily have kind of a major impact, whether it's data privacy impact, operational impact. But when you start talking about larger incident and coordination, with an incident response firm and multiple stakeholders, those incidents vary in complexity and scope, and I don't believe you can have like a cookie cutter playbook that you can employ each time to respond to it. I think you can have an incident response plan that talks about some of the higher level items, but I'm personally quite skeptical about playbooks in that respect.
Let me ask you this to build off of cookie cutter. I know we've said, like, we preach it all the time. Pick your incident response coordinator. How do you choose who that person is? Because now that I'm thinking about it, it shouldn't necessarily be the person on the highest top of the totem pole, right?
At
Because
Tevora, it's the most handsome. I'm just saying. Just kidding.
But yeah, I feel like it's that person that needs to be, in my opinion, like cool, calm, collected, aware of the playbooks, know what they are, and he or she is like the driver of the bobsled team, right? Needs to kind of guide everybody. So what is this? What is approach in
I'm just
choosing that
picturing
person?
Cash and Cool Runnings right now, but
It's bobsled time.
Yeah. So how do you pick an incident coordinator?
Yeah, so I think like if you look for the ideal person, so it's really a combination of personality and skills and experience, but also institutional knowledge. So as you mentioned, Kaj, I think it has to be someone who doesn't panic very easily, can stay calm and cope with pressure, a lot of pressure, because incident coordinators get a lot of pressure and stress during a major event. But it also has a person who can communicate with technical audiences, like an incident response firm, IT vendors, but also can translate the kind of the technical jargon into more business level language and updates. So instead of talking, to let's say to the chief information security officer about shim cache, they can say that essentially a malware infected a critical system and there's the potential of unauthorized access to data.
Make it sense.
So and I would say that that person, the ideal person should have also a lot of institutional knowledge. So many organizations have very complex operations, often in multiple countries or geographic locations, and it's very important that it's someone who really knows who to reach out to people, how to reach out to people, who those people are, and who can help out in a specific situation. Because you can have a plan, but you cannot script a playbook for every possible situation. So it has to be a person who can actually just figure things out on the fly sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. That's good.
Yeah, especially with ransomware. We know that's getting crazier, right? It can't get more on the fly than with ransomware.
Yeah, I guess on that, what would you say is the one thing or top maybe three things that a company can do fairly easily, I guess, maybe not easily, to prepare for ransomware?
That's a great question, Matt. And actually, when I think about ransomware, I don't think about ransomware as a malware or the kind of objective. I think it's what I typically recommend to clients that they understand how ransomware operators, conduct the operations. Because in the past, it used to be self-replicating worms. So essentially, WannaCry infects your network and propagates over SMB or some other mechanism. Whereas these days, you really have ransomware operators and people on keyboard who progress through the typical life cycle. So they have to compromise your network, whether it's for phishing or vulnerability exploitation, establish footholds for malware, then escalate privileges, move laterally within the network. So instead of what I say to organizations, instead of focusing on ransomware itself, focus on the entire life cycle, which means, protect your Active Directory deployment against credential harvesting, techniques. So, for example, you can implement jump boxes to restrict access to your domain controllers. You can, implement certain measures to prevent exposure of credentials. You can disable interactive logon with service accounts because they are often compromised. You can implement the Microsoft administrative tier model when you separate, admin, member server, and kind of end user asset identities, and have a level of logical separation. And what is really useful or beautiful about this approach is that you can do it as part of day-to-day operations, and you don't have to have budget or dedicated projects. And the low-hanging fruits gives you possibly the most protection for the resources that you have to expend. Of course, tools like EDR are very important, and there's a lot of controls you can implement to reduce the risk. But what I tend to say to clients, focus on the on your basic IT security hygiene, and also think about ransomware in terms of early detection and response. Because if you detect a ransomware operator on the very edge, in the very early stages of the life cycle, like the initial access, you just contain the incident and off you go. Otherwise, if the attacker has all the time to escalate privileges, compromise domain admin account, that's when it really becomes a problem. So I would say, focus on the basics, but also focus on detection and response. Don't necessarily think about ransomware in terms of the malware and what you need to do to protect, the malware from execution on the system itself.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that, and I think that's the hard part that people don't understand is, ransomware is just another form of malware, but it's how it got there, right? That's kind of where we want to start. We have, we won't say names, but we've got, a few where I think the hygiene of their perimeter is not great. And then also the hygiene internally is not great. And jump boxes, holy crap. It's, for some organizations, this is a game changer. I mean, it's it's really important. So definitely, I think that is all good information for anybody who's listening. You should definitely be writing down those notes.
Jump box.
One thing you mentioned earlier was a couple things, but was you talked about nation state and not having kind of a playbook for that. Obviously, right? But I guess this was one that Cash had as far as questions go. It was, what is the biggest difference that you see as far as tool sets go from nation states to just your run-of-the-mill Eastern European type attackers? Well, those are kind of nation states, but you know what I mean? So what's the difference between like a government attacker and, your average hacker that's sitting in his basement in Europe or something?
Well, so I think that would be a good question to a threat intel person. So I'm not a threat intelligence analyst, but I'll do my best to answer. So
another good question that I have is about threat intel. So let's go.
Okay, let's talk about it. So I think the main difference is, I would say, the resources that you have and the nature of the attack. So let's say if you're a ransomware operator, your main objective is essentially to monetize from the attack, and so you don't really care, who the victim is. You just essentially go for the organizations that are not secure and where you're going to get the most value for the resources that you have to expend. So, for example, if I'm going to compromise a bank and it's going to take me 1 month to escalate privileges, that doesn't make sense if I can compromise a manufacturer and move through the life cycle within 5 to 6 days because of insufficient controls. So I would say that cybercrime, at least in my experience, is more opportunistic. Whereas advanced threats or nation state, they attack specific organizations for specific purposes, and they have the necessary resources. And I think they are really patient. They can stay on the network for weeks, month. They are not in a rush because they've got a very specific objective. Whereas cybercrime, they just want to monetize on the attack. But also, Matt and Kash, what I observed over the years is that I think in the past it used to be relatively easy to attribute an attack to an actor based on malware. Whereas I think these days both APTs and cybercrime, they tend to use kind of more off-the-shelf tools, and I think it's more and more difficult to distinguish or attribute an attack based on the tactics and tools employed by threat actors. That's just my observation, but as I said, that would be a very good question to a cyber threat intelligence analyst. But what are your observations based on the cases that you investigated?
I think knowing who kind of was behind it is pretty tough nowadays. Even we see in the media, right? The first thing that they say is like, oh, we think it was this group, and you're like, how did you even come to that conclusion? Like, we're 24 hours into this. Like, how did you, and then you find out later on, like, oh, it wasn't really that group, but it was someone who was kind of in the same family as that group. You're like, oh, okay. So you don't really know. You don't really know what you're talking about.
And I think it's becoming even more difficult with, malware as a service and some of this stuff as a service ecosystem or model. When you have, let's say, malware developer, and then you have third party.
And they sell it, right?
Exactly, and they sell it. So I think it's attribution is becoming, more and more difficult these days. But also, definitely. I think from an IA perspective, attribution, I think it's important because it augments the incident life cycle. For example, I led cases when we would have a single indicator of compromise, and a good cyber threat intel analyst was able to pivot on that indicators and deliver us a bunch of other indicators that we could use for analyzing data, and the results were remarkable. But I think, like from kind of a legal perspective or law enforcement perspective, you cannot really, I think, like law enforcement finds it very difficult to prosecute someone based on attribution if the actor resides in a country that is not friendly towards the United States or other Western countries. So,
right. Yeah. Like, I mean, one that I always talk about from time to time, well, there's a couple, but like Fin7, it was great because we had tons of IOCs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we knew the clients that they were going after, right? So if it was like at the time it was hospitality and quick serve, or I forget what the term was, but it was restaurants. And so we were like, okay, well, if it's a restaurant or it's a hotel, like it's probably Fin7. So let's look at the IOCs we got, and you could, not always, but get a hit, right? You would get a hit at least on one of their callback servers or something. And but nowadays I feel like, at least in the last few incidents that we've done, we've been having to find our own IOCs and had really nothing to run off of. We've had a lot of one-offs too. Like we haven't had a whole lot of different groups as far as we can tell. It looks like they're just individuals, like you said, that bought it off the shelf, and then you have groups like Lazarus Group, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, they're kind of connected to a lot of different groups, right? Because they've provided all these different tools to these different groups, or at least on the black market. And so it's really tough to know who you're dealing with.
What I would say,
I think the signatures for the, for the pieces of malware is probably like the easiest way to really identify it versus the IPs and the infrastructure that they're using. So
what I would say that, always check for Cobalt Strike.
Yeah, definitely Cobalt Strike. And then we always do a search for PowerShell. We just look for any PowerShell with network connection.
Exactly.
Anything. So
and in a way, because again, this is just maybe an opinion, because I think the cybercrime industry is kind of standardizing. That makes it a bit easier for incident responders also to conduct investigations, because typically we may not know what the threat actor behind an attack is, but we may have a pretty good, a good idea of what tools they might be using based on past cases and past investigations, like mentioned PowerShell with network connections, or like Microsoft Word spawning PowerShell or command line. That's never
That's not
expected.
normal.
Or Cobalt Strike in your environment. What are the chances that you have a pen test right now and the pen test is using Cobalt Strike? So
Right.
So on one hand, I think like the threat landscape is evolving. And threat actors are able to scale out the operations because of the malware as a service model. But on the other hand, I feel that they are starting to use kind of standardized tools, and in certain cases, it's easier to detect the activities.
Yeah. This is kind of off topic, but in our world, I was just curious.
Yes,
So
yes.
we had one recently. It was kind of funny. Microsoft ATP, the threat, was it advanced threat?
Protection.
Is it protection? Is that what it's called? The EDR solution that they have?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, client had it deployed and
Now
it
I'm
started
making my
doing a ping sweep of the environment from a VoIP server. And they were like, "Oh, that's odd," right? So they talked to Microsoft. Microsoft's like, "Yeah, no, that's our new thing. We do that." We're like, "Okay, it's really weird." So we get in there and we look at the PowerShell script, and it's like this really convoluted base 64 encoded PowerShell script that is doing a ping sweep, and it looks super sus, right? Like super suspicious.
Yeah, for sure.
And no, sure enough, it's Microsoft, and so it was like almost a nightmare to try and deal with this, because we didn't know if there was an attacker, but it turns out it was just Microsoft being weird.
Yeah, that's a very good example. I think context really matters in IR, and again, I think what I sometimes try to communicate to clients is that it's not really a binary scenario when sometimes a certain indicator of compromise is high fidelity or low fidelity. It depends on context. I mean, PS exec is an example. Is often used by threat actors for lateral movement and deploying, malware ransomware. But at the same time, it's used by many admins who may not necessarily have access to a good software deployment tool. So I think context matters a lot.
Oh yeah, PS exec gets flagged all the time.
So, this kind of brings this to mind. What I want to know what your opinion is on the other side of it, right? This is like the technical side, and you stress on the non-technical side of it too, right? Ransom. It's like the key term, ransom. What is your thought about it? Do you pay it? Do you not pay it? And especially nowadays, kind of like to build on what you guys were talking about, it's kind of harder and harder to determine who the threat actor is. And in the past, that was a real big deal, right, Matt? I mean, it's like you knew who the threat actor were. Hey, they're a legitimate business. If you pay them, they're good for their word. But now it's like it's getting more and more coin tossing. We actually seen recently some of these new guys. It's like they buy the software, they kind of tweak it, and it doesn't work, or it kind of works, or they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Let us try to figure out why it doesn't work for you." So, what do you do? Do you pay? Do you not pay?
Yeah, so this is the moment when I need to make sure that I don't get fired.
We can skip it if you want. It's not a big deal. What's your personal opinion of paying ransom?
What's your personal unofficial?
What I would say is that I would give organizations some considerations, because if you ask the government or law enforcement, of course you're gonna get guidance not to pay. But kind of from an operational perspective, many organizations don't have good backups, or they cannot just they cannot recover from,
or they're compromised, the backups.
So for me, it's really a business decision. I don't have very strong opinions about whether to pay or not pay, and I'm not saying this to be politically correct. I just don't have very strong opinions. What I would say is that don't wait until you have the ransomware deployed in order to figure it out. So I would say if you have cyber insurance, speak to your cyber insurer and a vendor and determine whether your policy covers ransomware payment. If it doesn't, ask them for guidance. I would say engage your legal counsel. You may even want to establish a policy, or you think that or if policy is not an option, you may, for example, want to create a checklist of considerations that you would essentially just pull during an incident and determine, okay, can we recover? Is confidential data at risk? For example, I've seen clients who I am aware of organizations that pay ransom not because they were unable to recover. They paid because of brand reputation. So, for example, from a legal perspective, there has been clearly unauthorized access to confidential data, but the organization didn't want that confidential data to be released to the public domain on the dark web. Right. So they paid because of protecting their clients and affiliates, not necessarily to get the decryption keys. And that's why we see double extortion these days.
100%.
So,
all the time.
So I would say, seek
triple extortion now too.
Yeah. So the message that I would have to the listeners is seek advice from legal professionals, cyber insurance, and have those discussions, because I think the situation is unique to every organization.
Indeed,
that's good advice.
Great.
And I don't think I don't think that was jumping. You weren't not answering the question. I think that was a good answer. Perfect.
But genuinely, I personally don't have strong opinions. I think it's really a business decision, and there are people. I focus.
There's a lot of variables.
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
a lot.
There are a lot of variables.
Agree. Yeah. I mean, when we design some of these tabletops, I try to put a lot of these variables, and it's a lot. It's like, do we risk it? Right now we got ransomware, and then they take our data as extortion factor, and it's like, well, what do we do? Do we protect it? How much downtime are we gonna experience? Can we get back up? Are our backups complete? Do we have to shut our doors tomorrow? I mean, the list goes on, right?
I was just thinking about Cash and I did a tabletop a couple years ago, and we were with the client. It was a ransomware scenario, and our tabletop was designed to where they wouldn't pay it, and then we would keep going. And so they're like, well, how much is the ransom? And we hadn't really thought about that. We're like, it's $4 million. And the guy was like, we'd probably just pay that. We're like,
all right, well,
okay, well, we didn't plan for that.
I'm going to tell you more next time.
So we learned our lesson. We now design the tabletop to go both ways.
and that's a good point, because I think, again, context matters. I was in a similar situation several years ago when I would say, I would include a specific figure in a tabletop exercise, and the CEO of that company happened to be in the room, and he said, for that amount, don't even, call me at night.
Really? Wow.
Because essentially, I think it's, it has to be in the context of the overall revenue of the organization.
Yeah,
I think that's why we see these days threat actors not necessarily asking for the same amount of money for every organization. They would do a bit of recon and research the organization, and they will determine what you would be able to pay, and they adjust, the negotiation tactics to what you are, willing to or might be able to.
We've seen it in the negotiation chats where, in the case of Babook, actually, Babook had rules that said they wouldn't touch a company that made less than 4 million a year. Right. And so the client was like, well, I don't make 4 million a year. Like, why are you guys attacking me? And they're like, no, we looked at your financials. Like, we know you make more than that. And that's why we're requesting this much. And they did.
And I think X-Force did the research, and I do not remember the exact. I don't have the name of the paper in front of me, but I think the majority of organizations that are targeted by prolific ransomware operators are really in Western countries like the US, Canada, and Western Europe, because those organizations will pay. There's no point of investing, let's say, 20 days of labor hours and resources into attacking someone who can afford, paying $100. It's really an ecosystem and organized cyber crime. They are organized like business.
They know what they're doing.
It's a full-blown business. Yeah.
Yeah. We had one. It was pretty big. It was across a couple different continents. Took out multiple domains. And I was not part of the negotiation process, but I brought in the negotiator to do it. And I never heard the number, but the FBI agent we were dealing with, he said it was the largest number he's ever heard for ransomware, which this was a couple of years ago, but it must have been pretty damn big because they would never tell me and they didn't pay it.
Yeah. Yeah, I typically do not get in, and well, not. I would say I never get in negotiations because it's just not, part of what we do.
Yeah.
But
Same
also,
with us. Yeah.
I also really believe that when it comes to negotiations, you really enter, the kind of crime world. So law enforcement might be involved. There might be legal counsel involved, and I think, what I would say is, those guys have the expertise. And I think our job as incident responders is really to focus on the investigation and deliver the necessary information or kind of supporting information that would allow them to make decisions. So we'll give them some ammunition maybe to negotiate or adjust the tactics. But I prefer to generally stay away from this type of conversations.
100%. We always bring the pros in for that. Like we have a couple different people that we work with that are all like ex NSA, ex FBI guys. But one thing that I learned from one of those groups was that when you are paying the ransom, you definitely want to look at what that person's reputation is or that group's reputation so that you're not funding terrorism, which I was blown away. I hadn't even thought of that aspect of it because then you open up a whole new can of worms with Department of Homeland Security and all kinds of stuff.
You don't know where that money's going.
So yeah, you definitely have to be careful of that. So, but
you have to be careful, and I think that's why it's best to leave it to professionals.
Yeah.
In fact, what I recommend:
wash my hands of it. I don't want anything to do with it.
Restore from backups, and then good luck. But no, I mean, like these conversations, though, I think to kind of wrap everything up more or less is have these conversations ahead of time, right? Don't wait, like you said, don't wait for the ransomware to be deployed and then start figuring out like, well, who do I call right now?
Exactly.
So have these conversations ahead of time, write stuff down, playbooks, review them, practice them. So when things actually do happen, it's, in your mind, I guess, right? You don't have to worry about referring back to it and pick a good framework, practice that too, be familiar with the other ones. There's no cookie cutter solution.
Yeah.
And
I think, Andrew's book, it's not going to come out specifically and give you the answer to ransomware, but in between the lines is the answer to ransomware. It's all preparation, right? For those worried. But anyone, I think Andrew's book's definitely a good guiding light for, setting up an instant response capability and maturing it. So good job, Andrew. You mentioned before we got on, you have some other stuff in the works, something about YouTube. Did you want to plug that?
I can mention it. So I always work on something because I get very easily bored. So, I remember when I was writing that book and, it was a very interesting experience because it was the first time when I published books. So I had to learn how to write a book.
Yeah.
And then, it was a very busy and I would also say stressful period in my life. And then I remember, submitted the final draft and I was like, it's a sense of emptiness. I need another thing now. What's
next?
Good. What's next? So actually, I'm planning a YouTube channel. Where I will be providing some practical advice and guidance on threat management and how organizations can essentially secure the IT environment. We talked a bit about, jump boxes, the administrative tier model. So I wanted to be kind of, provide practical and actionable advice to organizations.
That's awesome.
But I also have another project in flight. I cannot really speak about it, but hopefully within several months there'll be more information about it.
Awesome. We'll keep us
maybe
posted.
Maybe we can bring you back in a few months from now and squeeze some info out of you.
All I can mention is that I'm actively talking to a publisher about writing another book, but I cannot really.
Nice. Okay.
Much. Yeah.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Well, looking forward to reading it. Andrew, thanks so much for coming. Thank you so much for your time. Great conversation. I learned a lot from it. I hope the two people that are still listening to us, they learned a lot from it. And so Andrew's book, Cyber Breach Response, that actually works. We're going to put some links where you can get it. Link to Andrew. We'll put your LinkedIn there. And if you care about me or Matt at all, come find us. Like, subscribe. Any final?
At the very least, we can show you how to get to Andrew. We can just
we just pointed to him, just like, call this guy. I don't know. But
Andrew, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah.
It was great catching up with you. Sorry that it took us 3 years to catch up again. We'll have to do more of these. So for sure, keep in touch, and we'll grab a beer next time I'm in the area.
Thank you for
or if you're ever
inviting
in Portland, there's plenty of beer for us to share here.
Yeah.
I'm
Any
always up for
final
good
words? Any shout outs?
No, so I'm also on Twitter, and I also run a personal blog at www.gorecki.com. So like what I try to do is really help the industry kind of standardize and mature. So if you have any questions, or there are certain topics that you would like my opinion about, or you would like me to write like a short blog post, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to help out.
Awesome. There it is,
Perfect.
ladies and gentlemen. Andrew Gorecki, thank you so much again for coming out. We'll put all the links to everything he just said, his Twitter, blog, how you can get in touch with him, and like, subscribe. Any final words? Is that it?
I think that's all. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
That's all, folks. Till next time. Tevora out.